Good evening. I figured that what happened is Brother Adam Evans knew that he was going to be down in Huntsville or over in Huntsville tonight. So as one Adam leaves, he wanted to substitute with another Adam. So that's what the trade-off is. Poor substitute, but I'm glad to be able to be here tonight as we turn our attention to 1 Samuel chapter number 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1. I just really appreciate the opportunity to come and spend the evening with you. This is probably the second or third time that I've been invited by you to come speak, and I always enjoy the topics that we get to talk about. I enjoy your company and the honor and privilege that it is to be able to come here and share some thoughts with you. So to be able to talk about this material tonight and be with you, especially last year, so many of us weren't able to have a summer series, to do these kinds of things. And so this is really trying to get back into the opportunity to be together and share this time. And so I'm really appreciative to be able to be here tonight, especially when I look on the list and see who has been, already come and done a lesson before me and who's coming after me. Really good lineup. And then you must have run out of good speakers who were available, and so here I am. So I'm glad that I get to pinch hit tonight. Great leaders of the Bible. Great leaders of the Bible. Now, I want to be honest with you as we get started tonight. I'm a little conflicted. Over in Luke chapter 18, this guy comes up to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus stops him right there and says, "Why do you call me good? There is none good but God the Father." So he came up and called him good teacher, and Jesus said, "Whoa, let's be careful who we're throwing around compliments to, and be careful how we're using these superlatives, good, better, best." And so if Jesus was reluctant to be called a good teacher, when we talk about someone being a great anything, I think we need to pause before we just rush ahead with our study. I think we need to be careful with that term. What does it mean to be a great leader? How does someone become a great person, a great man, a great woman, let alone a great leader? And I want us to think about that tonight, honestly. I don't want to give just a series of simple terms, of easy answers. I want to challenge us tonight to consider how serious a statement it is to say that someone is a great leader. The reason that I want to do that is because when we read about Samuel's life and we test his greatness, it's questionable. I think I would have rather had some of the other leaders that were chosen for the summer series this month or next. I think I would have preferred to have had someone from the pages of the Bible that was a little bit easier to diagnose and to claim with certainty, this is what a good leader looks like. Because I want to show you just very quickly in Samuel's life some of this stuff that goes on, and I want to ask the question, can we put Samuel in the category of a good leader? And I don't want this to be a foregone conclusion. I don't want to just assume, well, he's on the list, so obviously he's a good leader. Let's challenge the concept of a good leader in the first place. If you're turning over to 1 Samuel, around the first couple of chapters, it's interesting to me that Samuel is mentioned over 120 times in the Bible. 120 times, that's a lot. So obviously the Bible thinks something about this guy. 120 references in the Bible to Samuel. However, 111 of them all come from 1 Samuel alone. They're all from the same book of the Bible. There's only like 10 or 11 references outside of 1 Samuel to this guy. He's not even mentioned in the book of 2 Samuel. Now, do you think that that's weird? If I told you to turn to 2 Samuel, you would expect to see some information about Samuel. He's not mentioned one time in 2 Samuel. He obviously didn't even write the book of 2 Samuel. He didn't even write the book of 2 Samuel. Why do we call it 2 Samuel? Now, I don't want to confuse you, and I don't want to cause a lot of problems with that, worry, and we can straighten that up really quickly. So when I say Samuel didn't write 2 Samuel, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be in the Bible or anything like that. What I'm saying is we tend to think about books of the Bible like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We think about those as being written by the person that is listed in the title. Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, etc., etc. James wrote James, those kinds of things. But even in the New Testament, that's not always the case. 1 and 2 Timothy, not written by Timothy, they're written to Timothy. And in the Old Testament, it's much different as well. A lot of times, not every book in the Old Testament is written out that way or called that particular way. Ruth, well, that is a book about a person named Ruth. Esther, that is a book about a person named Esther. Job, a book about a person named Job. Most likely, Job, Ruth, and Esther didn't write those books that we have in our Bible. Those were the main characters. Those were the main people of emphasis in the story. And that's what happens in Samuel. The book of Samuel, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, was really originally one book. Originally, it wasn't a book at all. Remember, books are historically rather new things. They didn't have books when the Old Testament, when the Israelites were living. Books are a relatively new phenomenon. Everything was on a scroll. And so the scroll only had so much room on it, and so you wrote down as much as you could on an average scroll, and then if the book wasn't over yet, if the writing wasn't finished, then you just started a second scroll, and you called it the second scroll of whatever story we were telling. And so Samuel is a story that is many years in the making. It covers a lot of historical events, and so it's a long book. And so there's the first scroll of Samuel, and then they ran out of room, but they still had some stuff to say. So they started a second scroll of Samuel, and that is our 2 Samuel today. In fact, even in some Bibles, in some translations, in some places, it's not even 1 and 2 Samuel. It's just Samuel. They just automatically combine it into two books. But Samuel dies in 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel 25, he's dead. They bury him. It's over. Except for one little thing we'll talk about maybe here in just a minute. But over and over again, when I study the life of Samuel, I come away a little bit disappointed. And maybe it's just me. But I wanted to show you why that seems to happen. In 1 Samuel, around chapter 3, we're going to skip the first two chapters because they're not even about Samuel. They're about his mother. His mother, very, very faithful. She's the one that prayed to God at the temple, at the tabernacle in Shiloh, that God would grant her a child. And she said, if you will grant this request, if you will grant my prayer and my petition, then I will dedicate this child to your service. I will lend him to you. All the days of his life he will serve you. God granted that request. And Samuel's born, and as soon as he is weaned, as soon as he's old enough to kind of live on his own, then she brings him to that place, and she gives him over into the care of Eli, who's the priest at the time. But as a child, look, Samuel's a sweet little kid, don't get me wrong, but he's not very bright. I mean, if I'm allowed to be honest with you. Because in chapter 3, he has this episode in his life where he's laying down at night, and he's in charge of watching the sanctuary where the flame of the Lord is, the fire that is lit. that represents God's presence. And Eli is off in the other part of the place laying down to sleep. And so Samuel is in charge, and he hears a voice saying, "Samuel." And Samuel sits up and says, "Here I am." And he assumes that Eli is calling to him. So he runs into Eli's room. Pitter, patter, pitter, patter, pitter, patter. If you've ever had kids or grandkids and they've been sleeping, and all of a sudden at 2 o'clock in the morning you hear the door crack open, and one of those kids pops their head in, and they get your attention, they wake you up. That must have been what Eli felt, because Samuel says, "Did you want something?" And Eli says, "Go to bed. I didn't say anything." So Samuel goes back to bed. And you know this story. I don't need to recreate the whole thing, but the bottom line is it's God that is calling out to Samuel. If you look in chapter 3, verse number 7, Samuel did not yet know the Lord at this time, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. Now, we can cut him a little slack because he's just a kid. We don't know how old he is at this point, but he's a young man. And it says he didn't know God. No, he didn't know God. He's serving in the temple and he doesn't know God. That's not a high recommendation. That's not a high mark of praise in my estimation. He doesn't recognize God's voice. He doesn't know who the Lord is. And so 3 times God calls out to him before he gets it, before he figures it out. And Eli has to tell him, "Look, God is talking to you, not me. So the next time you sit up and say, 'I'm your servant, I hear,' you tell me what to do." And then God revealed himself to Samuel. And that is how Samuel becomes a prophet. A pretty big deal, a pretty big important prophet that we'll talk about later. But initially, there's a false start right out of the gate. Something to consider. And Samuel grows up and he does a lot of stuff, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff. But I also want to point out, unfortunately, if he failed as a child, he was an even worse failure as a father. Now, I don't think that this is entirely Samuel's fault. If you look in Samuel chapter 2 and verse number 12, it says that the sons of Eli were worthless men, and they did not know the Lord. Does that sound familiar to you? Eli's own children, his own 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they did not know the Lord, even though they had lived their whole life serving God with their father. Kind of like when Aaron becomes the high priest, when God tells Moses, "Aaron, your brother, is going to be, this is the family, his line are going to be the most important ones." And Aaron's 2 sons are also unfaithful, and God punishes them for their wickedness. The same thing will happen to Hophni and Phinehas here, because they were worthless men. And so even though Eli does a great job as a priest himself, he does not pass that passion on to his children, and they are corrupt. And as great a man as Eli was, unfortunately, it seems possible, this is me reading between the lines, so forgive me if you don't agree, but it seems likely that Eli didn't know how to teach Samuel how to be a good father either. And so when Eli is raising Samuel, Samuel does not learn how to be a good father to his own children, because we see later on in 1 Samuel, I believe it's chapter number 8, when we read that Samuel does the same thing, makes the same mistakes with his children. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes, and they perverted justice. And there we see how Samuel follows in Eli's footsteps. And it is unfortunate. His sons are worthless children, just like Eli's sons were worthless children. And so Samuel struggled when he was a young child to hear the voice of God. And Samuel struggled as an adult to raise children who would be passionate about serving the Lord the way that they should be. And then we also see that Samuel as a leader wasn't great. Here we are in chapter 8. When all of this takes place about his sons, what does it say in 1 Samuel 8, verse 4? Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, listen to this. This is great. This is great. Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. So give us a king. How complimentary. What a great way to start a conversation. Samuel, you're old. We don't need you anymore. And we don't like your kids. They're worthless. So we need you to do something for us. We need you to replace yourself and your sons. We don't want you. We don't want your sons. And so he is rejected. What kind of a ruler are you? What kind of a judge are you when your people reject you, when they turn their back on you, when they say, nah, no thanks, we're good? You know, as a ruler, I don't think that is a very complimentary statement about your service. So at the end of verse 5, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. This thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. Now, here's when we're reminded. God comes along and he has words of comfort for Samuel. In chapter 7, the Lord says to Samuel, you remember this, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me from being king over them. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit more in depth here in a minute, but I think it's important to remind us as we start talking about great leaders of the Bible. Is David one of the leaders we're going to talk about this summer? I think so. You think Solomon is going to be one of the leaders that we talk about? Maybe Josiah? I don't know. I didn't look that far down the list, being honest. But these are great leaders who were kings over Israel. God doesn't want Israel to have a king. God's plan was not for there to be a monarchy in the first place. All of the great stuff about David, who's a man after God's own heart, David never should have been king in the first place because there never should have been a kingdom. It should have been judges. It should have been individuals with limited power, with smaller responsibilities, with God sitting on the throne as the king all the time. But because of outside pressure, the nations, we want to be like the nations. Everybody else is getting a king. We want a king. That would be great. Let's look like them. But that's not the only problem, you see. They did not ask for a king until Samuel and his two sons spoiled the party. You see what I'm saying? If they had had great leaders, if they had had great judges, then it seems less likely that the people would have said, we don't like this system anymore. We want to replace it with a monarchy. We want a king to be over us. You see what I'm saying? The more and more I think about this, the more and more you dive into the details about Samuel's life, he seems to go from one failure to the other. And so finally God says, go ahead, let him have a king. Okay, fine. And so Samuel goes about appointing the king. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 10, by the way. 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 22. The first king, 1 Samuel 10 verse 22, the first king that they pick, the king that just really gets Samuel's attention. Oh, this is the guy. They have a conversation together earlier on in the chapter. It's a really, interesting exchange. But the bottom line is in chapter 10, Samuel says, all right, you guys want a king? I'm going to give you a king. Everybody come out here and we'll cast lots and we'll see who the king's supposed to be. And so they do this process by which they demonstrate God is choosing our king. And they go through by tribes, and it's the tribe of Benjamin. And they go through by houses, and it's this guy's house. And then they go through this guy's house, and it's like, it's going to be one of your kids. And so one of your sons, which son is it going to be? Well, it's none of them. They go through each one of the guys that's there, and it's like, well, it's none of them. So Samuel says, you don't happen to have another kid somewhere, do you? And he goes, yes, I do have another kid. His name is Saul. And what does chapter 10 and verse 22 say about Saul? They inquired again of the Lord, is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage. This is the first king that Samuel picks out. Is a guy who's so scared of a crowd that he hides in the coat room. Now, don't get me wrong. God is the one who appointed Saul. God picked Saul, so I'm not trying to overlook that. But, and that's back in chapter 9 and verse 17, since we're trying to put all these puzzle pieces together. In chapter 9 and verse 17, when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, here is the man of whom I spoke to you. He it is who shall restrain my people. So it's still God working here, but you got to imagine from Samuel's perspective, okay? Here is Samuel. Now picture this. Picture this. Samuel is standing up in front of all the crowds of people. You want a king? I'm going to give you a king. Everybody gather around. We're going to go through this process and we will anoint a king. And you feel confident. Samuel has got to feel confident because the day before, God pointed at this kid and said, that guy right there, that tall, super handsome, good-looking fella right there, that's the one. Oh, yeah. And Samuel was like, that was a good choice, Lord. I like that. That's what a king should look like. So Samuel is standing before all these people, feeling confident that God has shown him who's going to be king, and everything's going to be great. And he says, here is the process to show you who the king is going to be. And we draw lots, and we draw lots, and we narrow it down, and we narrow it down. And it's like the magician who's doing the card trick. And he's like, pick a card, any card. And he goes through and he shuffles, and he says, is this your card? And the guy says, no. Oh, okay. Is this your card? No. Oh, okay. And then he goes through every single one of the cards in the deck, and the magician says, is this your card? Is this your card? Is this your card? And then he runs out of cards. And so that's a bad magician, right? Unless he's going to make the card, come out from behind your ear or something like that. But this is not a lesson about magicians, so we'll move on. But Samuel gets to the end of the list of all the people, and he's like, I know who's supposed to be here. I do not see this guy anywhere. And so he's gone from feeling confident to having an empty deck of cards in his hand, and he doesn't have anybody else to point to. This big, strapping, tall, handsome, imposing man who is supposed to rule the nation, and Samuel says, is there somebody else around? And God says, yeah, go check in the luggage. Go check in the coat closet. There's this guy hiding back there. How do you think Samuel feels? Standing in front of that group, I'm going to show you who your great new leader is going to be. And it's this guy hiding in a coat closet. Come on. Doesn't that feel like a failure to you? If you're Samuel, doesn't that feel like a failure to you? In chapter number 16, eventually that king is going to be rejected, right? Saul, he serves as king for about 40 years. So it's not like this happened the very next day. But Saul is rejected from being the king. And God tells Samuel, okay, it's not Saul, it's not Saul's house. I need you to go find the next king. And what does Samuel do? 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse number 1, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul since I've rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I'll send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. And so the next time Samuel is given the task of going to appoint the next king of Israel, he's a chicken. He's afraid. I don't know what I'm going to do about this. If I try to leave the palace, Saul's going to catch wind of it. He's going to have my head on a platter. And so he has to figure out a way to sneak out of the palace, tell a little bit of a half-truth. It's all pretty disappointing. Over and over and over again. I mentioned in 1 Samuel 25 and verse number 1 that Samuel dies. Typically speaking, when somebody dies in the Bible, that's the last time we hear from them. with one notable exception. His name is Jesus. That's a different story. But in 1 Samuel chapter 25, it says, Samuel died, all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his house in Ramah. So he's dead and gone. Except he's not gone, because there's one final little scenario, one final little situation that I want to kick out at you as we close up this point and try to figure out the answer to this question: is Samuel a great leader or not? If you turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 28, and I'm just gonna toss this out there as a little tidbit for you to go home and play with. I'm not even going to get into it. And if you didn't know this was in the Bible, after Samuel dies, a witch brings him back in a seance to give Saul some advice. Which Samuel said, bringing people back from the dead to do a seance is a bad thing. And yet Samuel himself is brought back from the dead as a spirit, and he comes back in this seance, and King Saul is there, and he has a conversation with a dead man. I don't know how I know how Samuel feels about it. He's upset. He's very angry about it. Now, if you didn't know about that, read 1 Samuel 28 later, or if you don't like my lesson right now, just read it right now. That's fine. I'll be okay. All right? But that's a whole nother ball of wax right there. But what I'm telling you is this is it. After 1 Samuel 28, he's gone. He's kaput. He's out. This is the kind of stuff that marks his life. Is this the hallmark of a great leader? Does Samuel get to be on our list of great leaders? From my perspective, no. But nobody asked my opinion, did they? I guess at the end of the day, that's the bottom line. I mean, I am standing up here in front of you, so I guess somebody asked a little bit. But what does the Bible say about Samuel? And we're going to have to figure this out. Turn back to chapter number 7. 1 Samuel chapter 7. When we start talking about the life of Samuel, when we start talking about what Samuel does, look in 1 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 15. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went out on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there also he judged Israel, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Now, most of the judges, this is a little bit of extra history, most of the judges had one little spot where they sat every day, and anybody that wanted some help would come to them for help, right? And so when we talk about the judges in the book of Judges, most of the time, some of them could have been overlapping a little bit, maybe, because one of them was in the southern part and one of them was up in the northern part, because they were very localized. But Samuel had a much bigger area. He would literally travel all throughout the year to give people help and aid and to judge them. We're jumping around a little bit. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 2. 1 Samuel chapter 2. What does the Bible think about Samuel? Let me phrase it this way. 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse number 20, is it 26? Yes. 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 26. The boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. Now this is the same Samuel that I told you was kind of a slow starter back when God was calling him. But do those phrases in 1 Samuel 2:26 remind you of another verse you've heard lots and lots in your lifetime? Over in the New Testament, Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, when it talks about Jesus, how he grew in wisdom and in stature and with favor with God and man. So when Luke is trying to figure out how to compliment Jesus, Luke knew his Bible. And Luke basically takes the same compliments about Samuel as a child and says Jesus grew in the same way. So that's a pretty big compliment. That's a pretty big deal. In Psalm chapter 99, one of those other places where it talks about Samuel, Look at the company that he keeps in the 99th Psalm. Psalm 99 and verse number 6. Psalm 99 is a psalm to the Lord who reigns, verse 1. The Lord reigns, let the people tremble. And it says in verse number 5, exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool, holy is he. And then it says in verse 6, Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Samuel also was among those who called upon his name. They called to the Lord, and he answered them. They called to the Lord, and he answered them. That's a big deal to say that God spoke, God answered, God had a relationship with Moses, with Aaron, and then it skips all those other people and jumps onto Samuel, because Samuel matters. In the pillar of the cloud, he spoke to them. Now, you remember the pillar of the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. That's in the book of Exodus. It makes sense that you would mention Moses and Aaron when you mention the pillar that followed the Israelites from place to place. But apparently Samuel had access to God in the same way that Moses and Aaron did in the tabernacle, around the altar, around the pillar, around the smoke and the incense, called the Shekinah in the Hebrew. And then finally, the one that we can't ignore, the reason probably that he's included in this list tonight, Hebrews chapter 11, right? He's only mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. Twice in the book of Acts, where it talks about him historically, and then he is listed in Hebrews chapter 11, which is the chapter of the heroes of faith, right? We're familiar with that. And he's one of the names that's listed down at the end of the chapter, Hebrews 11, verse number 32. What more shall I say? Time would fail me. I would run out of time if I started talking about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. So side by side with who? With David is Samuel. We read the events in Samuel's life, and from our perspective, Samuel is not much to think about. And yet the Bible gives us a different perspective. God's inspired writers tell us that we need to look at it differently. Why? Why does Samuel deserve our attention even after all these failures that we've mentioned tonight? Let me point out a couple of reasons. The rest of these are all in 1 Samuel. So let's start in 1 Samuel chapter 2. 1 Samuel chapter 2, when it talks about what Samuel does, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse number 35, this is God speaking in a vision about Eli's house and about how Eli will be replaced. And God says, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house, and he will go in and out before my anointed forever. Samuel set his heart to follow God, his will and his mind. That is why Samuel is given a better position. I want you to look finally in the last couple of minutes at 1 Samuel chapter 12. Even though Samuel's going to live for several more years, as Samuel steps back as the judge and allows Saul to ascend to be the king and to take authority in the kingdom, this is his farewell address. And a lot of famous, important figures in the Bible give kind of a farewell address. Moses and Joshua and others. And Samuel, David gives an address. Jacob gives a farewell address over and over. All these different people do this. Here is Samuel's in 1 Samuel chapter 12. And let me just show you what he does. Here is why Samuel was a good leader. First, he was honest with everyone, and he didn't abuse his power. Look in verse 3 through 5. Here I am, he says, testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Tell me, and I will restore it to you. And they said, You have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand. I hate that this is so simplistic that we can overlook it, but a great leader has to be an honest leader with the power that he has. He has to treat that power and that capability honestly and not use it for personal gain. We shouldn't have to say that, but in today's world, when we see politicians who are out for themselves and who are willing to get what they want on the backs of anyone who gets in their way, we need to state it clearly and emphatically. Any leader who abuses their power for personal gain cannot be a great leader. And Samuel was a great leader. In verses 6 through 11, he reminded them of their history. He refused to allow them to forget about their God. Look in for instance, verse 8. When Jacob went into Egypt and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your fathers cried out to the Lord. And the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God. We know that that's a history that was repeated over and over and over again. Samuel refused to let the people fall into that trap again. You can't forget God. They still turned away from God, but Samuel was determined not to let them forget their history and their God. In verses 12 through 15, he continued to tell them the truth. In fact, he continued to tell the truth even to the new king who had the most authority in the land. And we take this for granted, that a prophet of God could simply stand up and tell the king what to do and what not to do. But you've got to understand, we just talked about rulers and leaders who abuse their power. And there were plenty of kings who killed prophets. There were plenty of kings who assassinated God's messengers for trying to teach them and tell them the truth when they were wrong. And yet, the very first king, this tall, imposing King Saul, Samuel was determined to tell him the truth. Verses 12 through 15, he does that. I love what he says in verses 21 and 22. Do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. The Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. He called them to follow God and not get sucked into following empty things. Here's what made Samuel a great leader in verse 23. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. And I will instruct you in the good and the right way. This is the same crowd of people that came to Samuel and said, hey, dude, you're too old. Get out of the way. Hey, dude, we don't like your kids. Get them out of the way. We reject you. We reject what you stand for. We reject God, and we want a king to be over us. And Samuel says, I'm going to keep praying for you. And I'm going to keep telling you what you need to be doing. He held the people to those standards, and he continued to stand up for what was right. Even though from an earthly perspective, we may think of Samuel as failing time and time again, because his heart was committed to God, to God's heart and God's mind, and because he continued to do these things that he says in chapter 12, we can conclude that Samuel was a great leader because he did what God wanted him to do. And because of him, God's people were able to remain in the direction they were supposed to go, even when they drifted away. God was able to use the monarchy to do good things, even though God didn't want there to be a monarchy in the first place. And part of that is due to the faithfulness of this great leader, Samuel. I appreciate your time tonight. We'll let the other ones come in and see what kind of trouble we can get into when the young ones show up.